Hey, this is Brandon Willie here from thirstgym.com with another episode of Training Talk, and today we're going to talk about block periodization. So in my previous video that I've done, I talked about linear periodization. You can check that out. I'll put a link to it in the description box so you can find it a lot easier. But today in block periodization, what we're going to talk about is this is more of an advanced programming style to help your training. So just to briefly recap, linear periodization is progressing over the course of a period of time. Now block periodization is going to take some linear principles, but we're going to chunk them into groups, so to speak, and focus on particular areas or blocks of training. And you'll see this again more in the, I don't want to say advanced, but it's more of an intermediate, an advanced beginner to intermediate, and sometimes even advanced programming style, depending on how deep you want to get into it. So I've got my cheat sheet here that I use with my interns when we discuss programming methods. So essentially I'm going to talk to you like you're one of my interns. We're going to keep this very simple, basic, very easy to understand, some general nuances, and that's it. If you've got more or want more in-depth discussion, please just leave a comment below and I'll be happy to answer your question, and maybe we can talk a little bit more in depth about any particular questions you have in a separate video. So the main thing about block training is it uses three main periods or stages in the programming style. So you've got three areas that you're really trying to focus on. The first one would be your accumulation phase, the next one would be your transmutation phase, and then the last one would be your realization phase. So to make this really simple, think of it as three stages. Each stage can be as long or as short as you technically want, although there's generally trends, I guess I'll say, that you'll see for your blocks of training. Now, per the literature, usually this is saying they're on average 2 to 4 weeks. Okay, that's what the literature is saying, 2 to 4 weeks. So basically about a month is pretty normal. And I think if you're somebody that does programming or has purchased programming from somebody, excuse me, or are looking to implement something like this, you think of kind of in months and stages of how you do your programming. You might be 3 months out from a powerlifting meet. You might be 4 months out from your competitive season. Your off season might be 2 or 3 months from when you're playing your sport. You get the idea. We generally think of months. This works pretty well from a calendar perspective as well. And 4 weeks obviously works well, thinking about how many days a week you can train to be able to keep these grouped together. So think about that as well. There are some of these challenges when you're thinking about the logistics of just putting the training together, especially when you're like myself and I train athletes for a living. I've got to think about all those other things from billing and things like that adds a complexity to this. But think about your blocks in generally 2 to 4 weeks, and maybe even upwards to 6 weeks, depending upon how you want to kind of look at these training blocks, so to speak. Now the first one, like I mentioned, is the accumulation phase. Now per the literature and the resources, this is usually when your loads are between 50 and 75%, okay? That's pretty light in terms of training loads. 50% for many people, you're still warming up on your major compound movements, right? And 75%, give or take, is around a 10 rep max. So we're talking about being able to do some good volume of work here. And I think that's the main thing you need to take away from the accumulation phase, is that the goal right now is not maximum strength, okay? The goal is to accumulate workload and some general conditioning or general physical preparedness in this block of training that you're going to use. Now, in my experience, usually your accumulation phase, you would want to be longer than shorter to be on the safe side, because the rest of the training comes down to how you work on the accumulation side. So if we're taking somebody that I don't want to say is brand new to training, but they've got some training underneath their belt, but now we're going to try to implement more of a block periodization. We want to accumulate a good amount of workload, make sure they've got a good backbone behind them in terms of, one, they're in shape enough for what they need to do, right? They're in shape enough to recover from the training that's going to come. So we're already looking ahead at the calendar of what do we need to be able to do to get to the finish line and be in a starting position. That's the accumulation phase. I really like the way Dave Tate kind of puts this, is that you're basically preparing to do the meet prep, if that makes sense from a powerlifting perspective. If your meet's 12 weeks out and you know you need 4 weeks to get ready, to start getting ready for the meet, that would be your major accumulation phase, would be pre-meet prep, so to speak, okay? So Loads are generally on the lighter end, and the goal is hypertrophy and general conditioning. You could certainly mix in a little bit of strength here if you really needed to, especially like a power lifter or something like that. But generally, that's what you're looking at your accumulation phase. The next would be the transmutation phase. Now, this is when the loads get from 75% to around 90%. So now this is what I like to think of as more of strength training. What most people are doing going into the gym, they're usually in some kind of transmutation phase. They just don't think about how they're laying things out. They've got that backbone of accumulation. Now they're just living in the kind of the transmutation phase, so to speak. And usually that's when you're going to start to see your weights ramp up a little bit. You're going to see some linear styles here, but you're going to be able to think about programming on a whole, and you don't have to live and die by the weight constantly going up. It can fluctuate throughout the week, or it can fluctuate throughout the month, where you can pull back and push a little bit to get those adaptations that you want. Because again, chances are if you're doing this, you're a little more advanced than just a regular linear periodization athlete. The last part here is the realization. That's 90% plus. To me, that's thinking of peaking, right? We're trying to physically stress the body to some extent to where we get a realization of what we can actually do. That's kind of where the name comes from, I believe. So we want to be able to realize what the true potential of our training is by getting in that 90% plus really frequently and really taxing the body, not only from a muscular perspective, but from a central nervous system perspective, to prepare it for the demands that are going to come at that competition, that meet day, that competitive season, okay? So as you can see, what I've got here on my notes, it can be similar to linear periodization or Western periodization, but it can be prolonged for a longer period of time or seasons or peaks. So these phases also are not set in stone. So you can bounce back and forth between a phase, because again, it says it can be as short as like 2 weeks. So the way I explain this to my interns is that if we're working with higher level athletes, we know where some important competitions are. Sectionals, regionals, semi-state, state, those are important. That's something we want to try to get ready for. Generally, we can say conference is pretty important, because how you place in conference might dictate a seeding later on the year. And then you got those random ones that are kind of like a big rivalry game. You want to put your best foot forward at a rivalry game, so you might try to get some realization for that competition as well. Obviously, with a sport like powerlifting or something like that, it's pretty set in stone. You got to pick your own meets and whatnot, so you don't need to move around in those, so to speak. But if you certainly want to try to see where you're at 4 or 5 months out from a meet, you can build up into a realization phase, get an idea where you're at, and come back down to that transmutation phase and continue to train and build. Or worst case scenario, you get injured and you need to pull back to that accumulation phase. You back off the high intensity, you go through more of the reps, you break down, you're doing some reconstruction on a particular lift. That to me would be accumulation phase. So you can shift in those. That's hopefully real world examples to how this applies to like a sport of powerlifting. Now, the pros of this periodization model is that training is only focused on what's needed at the particular time. So we kind of talked about that accumulation phase, general physical preparedness. It's really all you're trying to focus on. You're not pushing for strength, you're not pushing for power, right? Mainly it's hypertrophy driven, right? But that helps you see endurance, maybe, things like that. So you can really focus on particular qualities. It can also, we kind of discussed, it can also allow for multiple peaks as you go back and forth between different competitions or what have you. So it's easier to pivot if you need to throughout the year, because you can fall into those percentage ranges and give your athletes and your clients a little bit more breaks. It also generally helps avoid burnout. So you're not living in that 90% realm all the time. So that gives your body the ability to recover, but you also get mental stimulus as well by mixing your training up. If you go back into accumulation phase, for example, generally that's more bodybuilding, hypertrophy-ish looking, and that can be a good mental break from somebody that does a barbell sport all the time. I think that's incredibly important and highly undervalued is the mental piece, which can be a whole separate video. And then this is also good for, like I said, late beginners and generally more advanced, intermediate to advanced athletes, depending upon, one, your chronological age, how old you are. I work with a lot of kids, so we have blocks of training in season, out of season, whatever. But generally, because they're so young, I'm not going to do a giant accumulation phase, a transmutation phase, and realization phase for somebody that's 13. Doesn't make sense, right? But I do need to have blocks of the year where I focus on certain qualities, improving movement and things like that. That can also fall underneath the block periodization piece. So Then the cons, what are the bad things about this particular training model? First of all, you really need to know what your athletes need to work on, okay? You gotta be a little more picky and choosy on what you're picking from an exercise selection standpoint, the amount of volume and workload they can handle, because as you can see, unlike the linear model, we're gonna spend our time in heavier loads, and so that's more stressful to the athlete, so we can't put as much on their plate. Now during the accumulation phase, you certainly could. You could have a nice wide variety of movements, and I think that's really good. However, when you start getting into that transmutation and the realization phase, then you gotta start to shrink those demands down so that you don't overtrain them. So for example, what I like to use, if somebody is big and outside their weight class, that's kind of like somebody I was, I didn't need that much transmutation time, that much accumulation time, because I was in such good shape that I didn't need to go back to that. Didn't really make sense to spin my wheels down there. I got to spend more time in the transmutation phase and focusing more on the strength piece rather than the hypertrophy piece, just because I was so outside my weight class and had to cut weight. So that's a good example. But it's also, again, like I have on here, it's taking away from the desired end goal. So if the end goal is strength, if they've got enough hypertrophy size, we don't need to train it. We need to do more strength work. And then another con here is knowing when to rotate the blocks can be challenging. So if you're doing this by yourself and you're not knowledgeable in this, knowing how to pivot and adjust your training towards what you have coming in the future can be a little bit tricky at times, right? If you're not doing a competition, how do you know how long you should stay in transmutation, or when you should actually try a realization phase, or when you need to go all the way back to accumulation phase? Generally, they kind of go linearly, but not always. Like I said, you can kind of hop back and forth, but it does take some experimenting. And again, how old you are, whether you're male, female, how big you are, small or tall, all that will change depending upon what you need. Then you also want to try to stay ahead of stagnation and overtraining. So that's where kind of being an advanced trainee does matter a little bit. You've almost got to be looking a couple weeks ahead of what's coming and try to predict whether your body is going to make it from a recovery standpoint. So like I said, you can't live in that realization phase forever. You can't stay there. You've got to be able to be like, well, when am my body going to start to say no? One, to prevent injury. Two, to prevent overuse issues to where you just start getting burnt out and then you stop progressing, and then overall thinking about the long-term training goals that you're going to have. So that covers block periodization in the very, very basics. Hopefully it's something you can use and understand. I think there's really good pieces to block periodization. All of my training that I do with clients and athletes does have some block influences or phases of how training is phased. I think all training should have some kind of block pieces. You could just be, however, what I'm basically trying to say here is that you can be a block guy, okay? That's all you do is just block, and there's nothing wrong with that. There's a lot of good stuff here. Just understand there can be some cons, and you probably need to know what you're doing with it. But I think if you're somebody that's looking for some training or trying to improve your training, try to understand how your training is moving in these phases or blocks, and I think that will help you to be able to understand where your training's going, how you can pivot, how you can make modifications as you go to those training blocks over time, and that will continue to let you see progress, definitely way faster than a linear model, so to speak, but just understand that there is some linear pieces built into that block model just by nature. So if you got any specific questions, leave them in the comment section. Be more than happy to help you. Hopefully you took something away. Thanks, have a great day.